Hello and welcome to tonight's talk with Robin Phayre on the Battle of Agincourt. Normally we don't go back this far in history, but as you know the museum does seek to tell all of the stories of conflict and how it's affected the county throughout the centuries. And actually coming up will be another talk on the Civil War as well. I'm talking to you tonight from our new exhibition in the Cloister Gallery, Into Battle, the Art of British War Comics. As you can see, lots of lovely artwork, original comics, and a really fascinating story about the history of British war comics. So please do try and come in when you can. There's lots for children to do as well. We've got a lovely light box, so you get to do your own work with comics and actually share that with family and friends, or just leave it here at the museum. We've got a couple of new exhibitions that have also opened. A Remembrance Pub upstairs on the top gallery as we get into Remembrance season, and also our Oxlet grant has come to an end and we have finished our Women and War and our Global Pod as well. So lots happening at the museum. If you do feel able to donate, please do so. It's only with your donations that enable us to carry on with the online talks and carry on with this really lovely exhibition programme as we get close to our 10th year anniversary next year. At the end of the talk, there'll be a live Q&A with David, and he will also talk you through the next few talks and events. But I will tell you about a really special remembrance concert on the 4th of November here in Woodstock. If you haven't booked your tickets yet, please do so. It's with the Waterloo and Rifles Band, and it's promising to be a really interesting and exciting evening. I hope you enjoy this evening, and we look forward to welcoming you back at the museum whenever you can.
I'm delighted to be here in the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. I'm going to tell you about the Battle of Agincourt, and I hope to weave into my tale some connections to Oxfordshire. 607 years ago, Henry V was in a barn in Maisoncelles, a little village just to the south of Azincourt. Here, he was entertaining several French dukes, nobles, and senior members of the defeated French army. A little way to the north, on the battlefield itself, lay about 200 English dead, but 6, 7, 8, 9, possibly, 1,000 French dead. And these Frenchmen were not common soldiers. They were the nobility of France. They lay in their heaps, in their expensive burnished armour, decorated with gold or silver and dressed in the family banners. There were 3 generations of families, grandfather, father and sons. There were 3 dukes, 8 counts, 1 viscount, an archbishop. The commander of the French army that day, Charles d'Albret, was dead, as was the constable of France, the admiral of France, the grand master of bowmen, the prévôt of marshals, and Guillaume de Martel, the bearer of the oriflamme, which was the battle banner of the French, and countless members of the same families. And the dead came from some of the cream of French aristocracy and the rulers and administrators of France, particularly of Normandy, Picardy and Artois. The English dead included the Earl of Suffolk and the Edward Duke of York, who had commanded the vanguard and the right wing of the English army. And his body and the Earl's body were both being boiled up so their bones could be taken back to England for burial. But I want to start by looking at what connections Oxfordshire has to the Battle of Agincourt. Well, one of the commanders was the Earl of Oxford, Richard de Vere. He had with him about 30 men-at-arms and 30 archers. There's some confusion as to his exact role, but it would appear that he commanded the rear guard on the move from Harfleur to Agincourt. And during the battle itself, he probably fought alongside Henry in the main battle or main body of the men-at-arms. And though Earl of Oxford, actually he had little to do with Oxford, living instead near King's Lynn in Norfolk, and was buried at Earl's Colne in Essex. Thomas Chaucer was the son of Geoffrey Chaucer. In 1414 he was the Speaker of the House of Commons and owned the manor of Woodstock, now Blenheim Palace, and so therefore probably owned the land on which we're standing tonight. He was probably ill on the day and he missed the actual battle, but his 11 men-at-arms and 36 archers were there. Thomas survived the battle, died in 1434, and is buried at Ewelme, just south of Oxford. William Banger from Nettlebed defended the baggage train to the rear of the main battle. He was a yeoman of the household and the king's kitchen. Edmund Lacey was a cleric at University College, Oxford, and a dean of the Royal Chapel. And I'm sure there were plenty of others from Oxfordshire, though in fact I lack time to sieve through the rolls of those names who went with Henry. Now, before I go further and describe the actual engagement, I want to briefly describe two winning factors that allowed the English to gain this significant victory. And the first is the ground on which both sides fought over. At that time of year, it is very muddy, especially following heavy rain. And I shall explain the significance of mud in a moment. The second is the English and Welsh archer. Now, it might be stretching a point to say that archers could be considered the light infantry of the army. They were lightly armoured with leather and heavy cloth rather than heavy metal, and could move swiftly around the battlefield. And if the archers and the armoured men-at-arms acted together, they were a formidable force. The archers would protect the armour, and to a certain extent, and could certainly disconcert the enemy armoured attack. And by the way, mentioning the Welsh, there were no more than 500 Welsh archers present. Now, this painting that I've got up at the moment is by someone called Loisot Leidet, and it is actually of the Battle of Poitiers, and it shows the archers engaging the French armoured cavalry and men-at-arms with great effect. The archers were flexible and able to swiftly move around in response to their commander's orders and the threat. And here you see the archers moving forward in front of the English and Burgundian armoured men-at-arms and beating back the French cavalry. So, the archers and armoured forces worked together again at Azincourt, and the French failed to apply the lessons of Poitiers, or for that matter the earlier battles of Crécy, where they lost heavily and the archers did enormous damage. Well, now let me look at where is Agincourt on the map. As you can see, it's not far off the main route on your way south to Provence. And I recommend going to visit it if you can. There's an excellent museum, diorama and example weapons. And by the way, don't look for Agincourt in your sat-nav, it is Azincourt. Now, I've been to Azincourt twice, the last time in the summer of 2015, just prior to the 600th anniversary of the battle. I took my drone with me, and so the aerial shots that I'm going to show you shortly are taken by me. I should add at this point that there is no archaeological evidence at all that has been found to confirm the site of the battle. There is no metal, no armour, spurs, arrowheads, rings, sword hilts, or even the bones of the considerable number of French who were apparently buried nearby. Now, I'm going to give you numbers during my talk, but there is an ongoing lively debate about the veracity of these numbers, how many died and how many lived. Now, let's have a closer look at the map. The battlefield lies between these four villages of Azincourt, Tramecourt, Maisoncelles, and Blangy-sur-Ternois. Why were the English there on the evening of 24th of October? Well, Henry wanted to exercise his claim to the French throne. He had good cause through his great-grandfather Edward III, and Henry was brought up believing it was his divine right. He was entitled to the French throne. And when Henry succeeded to Henry IV, he was determined to exercise that right. The French king, Charles VI, obviously did not accept that and did not accept Henry's demands. And before Henry set sail that year, there was a degree of negotiation between them, but it came to nothing. And when Henry launched his invasion that August, he chose Harfleur at the mouth of the Seine as the eventual route to Rouen and Paris. Harfleur was merely a necessary precursor to a bigger battle to come. So let's have a closer look at the two protagonists before we actually get onto the battle itself. Henry V has had mixed reviews, but he was probably one of the most organised, efficient and respected kings we've ever had. He was very able, he inspired devotion, and was generally regarded as honourable. He was undoubtedly very brave and an excellent soldier, who had been hardened by battle in Wales and had been wounded in the face by an arrow. And he knew how to get the best long-term results from people. For example, he made it clear to his own army that they were to treat the local French well as he advanced from Harfleur to Calais. They were very much his people. He also made sure that he honoured his word to pay his soldiers and to repay debts. So he was an excellent administrator and logistician who surrounded himself with very able people. They got things done. For example, Henry's men raised some 3 million in modern money to acquire, requisition and contract for some 1,500 ships from English, French and Zealand ports that were converted to from merchants to fighting ships and transports to ferry the thousands of soldiers, horses, equipment and provisions for the campaign. Henry was domineering, ruthless and cruel when required. And when he came to the throne, the nation was weak and drifting, but he left it dominant in Europe. And his coat of arms that I show here included the French fleur-de-lis as well as the English lions. And by the way, it was King George III who was the last king to include the French fleur-de-lis in his coat of arms. He gave it up in 1801. Charles VI, the King of France, was a bit of a nutter. He was known as either the beloved or the mad. For example, in August 1392, en route to Brittany with his army in the forest of Le Mans, Charles suddenly went mad and slew 4 knights and almost killed his brother. And from that date, things went downhill, and his insanity became more frequent and of longer duration. And during these attacks, he had delusions, believing that he was made of glass. He could also attack servants or run until exhaustion, wailing that he was threatened by his enemies. Unable to concentrate or make decisions, he lost control of his court. And this resulted in civil war between the Armagnacs, who supported his house, the House of Valois, and the Burgundians, who were more inclined to the English. And when it came to making swift decisions in battle, the enmity between these two groups led to disarray. So Charles VI was not fit to lead his army at Agincourt, and there were arguments as to who should command. The command structure was fractured and disorganized, and that resulted in poor planning and an inability to quickly react to events during an engagement. So, the battle for Harfleur. Henry set sail with perhaps up to 1,500 ships to transport not only the soldiers, animals, logistics, and non-combatants. Whilst we have a pretty good idea of the numbers of soldiers and archers that were involved, there was an unknown number of men in the logistic tail, or baggage train, and these included surgeons, fletchers, chaplains, smiths, grooms, runners, and so on. Oh, and as another example of the antecedents of light infantry, the army then did rely on trumpeters and drummers for passing signals during a battle. So Henry managed to take Harfleur by the 23rd of September, though there were considerable losses through battle and disease, primarily dysentery. So Henry then had a dilemma. His force was weaker than he'd intended, and the period available for campaigning was coming to an end, and he now lacked the resources in terms of soldiers and siege engines to take either Paris or Rouen. Should he depart or try something else? Well, he decided that he should move through France at will and show his flag. So instead of sailing home, he wanted to go to his other possession, Calais. So he set off for Calais on the 8th of October, and he'd worked out that he could get there within 8 days, a perfectly reasonable time period based on a calculation of marching 19 miles a day. And he made sure that he had enough food and supplies, therefore, for 8 days, not the 15 or more that it actually took to get to Azincourt. And when he departed Harfleur, his army at that time numbered in the order of some 6,000 to 7,000 archers and about 900 men-at-arms. Now, while this was going on, the French, of course, had organised their army, and they wanted to take on the English and prevent him moving north, and so they quickly advanced to cut him off as Henry proceeded north. And on this map, the French are in blue and the English in red. And the French successfully blocked successive routes across the Somme, forcing him to go further and further east. And eventually he managed to cross the River Somme at Royan. Now, it was at this time Henry realised there was going to be a major engagement. He couldn't avoid it. It was inevitable. And so he ordered the archers to gather long wooden stakes and to carry these with them from then on, a vital addition to their equipment, as we shall see. So let's go and look at the battlefield in a little bit more detail. This aerial shot is taken from Tramecourt. Shows the area of the battlefield as it is now, and I show that now in pale green. The French had made a very poor selection of ground upon which to fight. The centre of the battlefield is a plateau, and the ground either side falls away, and both sides of the battlefield are wooded, and the field becomes narrower to the south. And the result was the French could not make the best use of their cavalry because the woods either side prevented them from outflanking the archers, as we shall see. So, as I explained with this sketch map, the ground has a funneling effect. It's narrower the further south, shown by these red lines. By the way, the area has always been planted by farmers for years before the battle, and that October it had been ploughed up. It was very wet and glutinous. And I now want to explain the ground in a little bit more detail, and I'm going to show you some aerial photos of the ground as I saw it in the summer of 2015. Though I must add, the area was considerably more wooded than it is now. So the first aerial picture is that looking north from the village of Blangy-sur-Ternoise, about 3.5 kilometres south of Maisoncelles. And you'll see the ground rises to the plateau to the north, where Maisoncelles and Tramecourt are. And this picture here shows the track. It's now a road going northwards up the picture to Maisoncelles. So, on the evening of 24th of October, Henry's forces were advancing up towards Maisoncelles, having made a crossing of the river that is shown here, which was left undefended by the French. And the English army crested the rise in front of them, they were horrified to see the glittering mass of banners, armoured knights and cavalry in front of them. And they immediately made an estimate that they were completely outnumbered, and made wild guesses that there were over 100,000 French to their front. Henry's forces quickly deployed into fighting order, and that is how they remained until the next morning, keeping a very careful watch in order not to be outflanked by a night attack. And they kept quiet in order to sow doubt in the minds of the French. The French couldn't estimate numbers either from the noise or from the number of campfires that the English were prohibited from lighting. Now, in the meantime, the French, Constable d'Albret and Marshal Boucicaut, decided it was too risky to attack immediately. They didn't actually have a very good idea of the size of the English forces. They thought that there were very few, but they were uncertain. And that night it poured with rain. The English stayed silent, confessed their sins, and received the sacrament. So convinced were they were going to die. Henry completed a recce himself and set others to scout the battlefield to get a clearer idea of what the French were doing. And he also toured his own lines, giving quiet encouragement to his soldiers. Now, my second aerial shot here, shown with the arrow, number 2, is looking north over the battlefield. And you see here Tramecourt on the right-hand side, and this is roughly in green where the English were, and the French in red. My third aerial shot is looking the other way, looking south from where the arrow is pointing again. There's Tramecourt, this time to the left-hand side, to the east. The the French are here, and the English are here. And my fourth and final aerial shot is looking west, again shown with this arrow here, looking slightly north towards Azincourt itself. And again, I show you where the English is in green and the French in red. Now, in 1415, Azincourt had a castle, but now most of it has disappeared, and it's difficult to pinpoint its exact location now. However, it's probably about here. And it may be that the French and the English heralds, who together agree on the outcome of a battle, winner and loser, may have been located high on the battlements to afford a view over the whole engagement. Let's have a look at the French plan now. The French did have a sound plan to defeat the English by neutralising the advantage that the English were perceived to have over the French in the form of their archers. Now, the French had forgotten the lessons learnt from Crécy and Poitiers. They didn't apply them. And the plan I'm about to describe is the one the French intended to follow, but they changed it. Or more likely, there were internal arguments amongst the commanders, and they implemented a plan off the cuff. So in green are the English to the bottom of the picture, and the French in red at the top. And the French army was normally organised into two lines, or battles as they're called, a vanguard and a rear battle. But they decided that if the English were to be organised into only one battle, which they were at Agincourt, they themselves would also only have one line or battle, as shown here. And in front of them, they would place the crossbowmen, and the cavalry were to be deployed on each flank, as I've shown. Slight disparity in numbers, 250 on the left-hand side and over 1,000 on the right. The cavalry were to neutralise the English archers by attacking them from the rear, as shown by these blue lines, and overcoming them with the weight of their armour. So this was shock and awe. And at the same time, the crossbowmen were to move forward and neutralise the English armours with volleys of arrows. And this was then to be followed up by further flank attacks from the cavalry to envelop the archers from the rear. And then, having neutralised the archers, the main body of the French army would move forward, the men-at-arms would launch themselves at the English battle and defeat them. That was the French plan, but it fell apart completely, as we shall see. So, as an aside, the French had raised the oriflamme, the French battle banner, which meant when it was raised there were no prisoners to be taken until it was lowered. And the purpose was to strike fear into the hearts of the English, especially the men-at-arms, the nobles, who could usually expect to be taken alive for ransom. However, in the event, the oriflamme carried by Guillain de Martel fell, and he was killed, and it was never recovered from the battlefield. So let's have a look at the battle, what really happened. The next morning, Henry stood his troops to before dawn. He himself dressed conspicuously in his bright armour and rode up and down in front of his troops, encouraging them and stating quite clearly that by divine right God was on their side, and so was St. George, and they would defeat the French today. And the respective armies were deployed according to the following diagrams. Now you'll note that there were 3 battles of French, the 3 lines of battle. And the front line, was considerably bigger than the second and the third. And it may be that they considered the English army to be so insignificant they would easily be broken. So just attack them with overwhelming numbers in the first battle. And the men-at-arms and nobles were very keen to be involved in the honour of defeating the English, and keen to capture the English men-at-arms and the king in order to get their ransom. So there was a preponderance of French noblemen and senior military commanders in the front, and that left the remaining 2 battles with a poorer command structure, too many chiefs in the front ranks, and they did not properly consider the threat that the English archers posed. And so when the armoured men fell, as they certainly did, the ability to control the battle tactically was impaired. And they also saw no reason at all to have their own crossbowmen and archers deployed in front, as the English were so weak, so they left them between the first and the second battles. And they were hoping the cavalry would neutralise the English archers anyway. So there we go. Now the English deployed in a single battle as shown here with the archers on both wings, about 2,500 on each side. Now Henry may have put some archers forward in the woods either side, but there is little evidence of that, and anyway it's considered to be unchivalrous to do naughty things like that. And now nothing happened. The expected French attack did not materialise. Why not? Maybe the French were waiting for more of their army to arrive, and there were reinforcements, but they were some way away. Now, as a consequence, Henry decided he could wait no longer. His men were hungry, frightened, and they were getting dispirited, and those wearing armour were getting cold as the metal leached the heat from their bodies. They needed to move to keep warm, so Henry decided to move forward. But before I describe what happened next, I need to tell you about the archers' tactics in a little bit more depth. So, archers are arrayed in lines, in depth, protected by stakes sharpened at both ends, and they're set at an angle to deter and skewer the attacking cavalry, as shown here. Now you'll see that the archers have placed arrows in the ground in front of them, not in their quivers, and that allows them to draw and loose their arrows very quickly. Of course, the arrowheads would pick up bacteria, but contrary to rumour, Henry's army did not deliberately poison their arrows, as some have suggested. Now, the wooden stakes probably were not as neat as those shown in this diagram. There'd be branches and whatever the archers could have found on the route of march. And this diagram here shows archers in red and the stakes in blue, in depth. There were a lot of them. And those stakes in white show that the flanks were protected and the rear. So now Henry seized the initiative and he advanced forward a few hundred metres, but not before he first moved his baggage train, the logistics tail. Why? Well, he needed the reserves of ammunition, particularly arrows, and there were, of course, food supplies and also valuable items, such as his own crown. And by placing the baggage train nearer to his own rearmost troops, they were a force to prevent an encircling movement or attack from the rear. And the baggage train, though consisting of pages and perhaps other men, older men, they were quite capable of defending themselves. All had to be able to fight. And the practice also was to put the horses in a circle around the baggage train to act as a buffer. So he ordered the archers and armoured knights to move forward to within French bowshot. And that was a huge risk to the army, as the archers had to uproot their stakes and hammer them in the new spot as quickly as possible in order to prevent being taken by surprise. But it was the French who were taken by surprise, not the English. The French did nothing, at least initially. Now, as soon as the English were established in their position, they opened fire onto the French vanguard with the intention of provoking the French to attack, and this they achieved. The French commanders gave the order for the cavalry to launch their flank attacks onto the archers, as had always been the original plan. However, the cavalry had been caught napping and were feeding and walking their horses, so the effect was somewhat lessened by a disjointed and rather ineffective attack. It was not a full force of cavalry that launched the charge. So instead of perhaps the thousands there might have been initially, they only launched a few hundred. And the distance to travel wasn't that far. The archers didn't have time to fire many arrows, but nevertheless there was an arrow storm, and this probably panicked the horses. Some of them were wounded. Now this is a picture I took of the models in the diorama at Azincourt, the visitor centre, and you can see the ground falls away to the left of the picture, top left of the picture, to the west. The cavalry, the French cavalry, is charging towards us from the top of the picture, and you can see on the left-hand side, that wedge, those are the archers in depth, and you can see, if you look closely, the stakes completely in amongst them. And the field has been ploughed. You can see it's just mud, glutinous mud. So the cavalry charging the archers were facing an arrow storm, hitting the horses and the riders, and I'm going to come back to that effect that the archers had a little bit later on. Suffice to say that although the chargers, the horses, were well trained and steady, they were used to loud noises, they were not used to the sound of an arrow storm, and they certainly weren't used to charging at sharp stakes, pointing at their chests. So let's have a look and see what a close quarter battle with the archers might look like. Well, here we can see in the foreground, the middle man, an archer who's firing. The nearest archer to us is just knocking an arrow, and he has other arrows planted in the ground in front of him. And he does have a reserve, the other one has a reserve in his belt as well. The shape of the armour, the French armour, is designed to deflect arrows as well as swords and axes, and it's difficult for an arrow to penetrate unless it hits the armour at right angles. And you can see the knight is falling from his horse as the horse is impaled on a stake. And I'm going to look at the kinetic effect of arrows a little bit later on. Now this is a stylized version of the effect of the arrows on the French cavalry. It causes a degree of chaos. So what happens is that the effect was to turn the horses, the cavalry, pursued by the arrows, as shown by the broken lines. But of course, as they withdrew, they ran into the advancing French armour, the men-at-arms. A little bit of chaos. So, as the first battle advanced through the mud, the horses and cavalry disrupted the advance, and I show now a concentration of forces. They're getting closer together. They've been forced together by the archers, and anyway, the French men-at-arms considered the archers as beneath them in terms of class. They were valueless to ransom. So we come to the close quarter combat, the melee. There was then hand-to-hand fighting, and that must have been extraordinarily violent and bloody, not to say noisy and disorganised. And to have this mass of armoured men rushing at you with swords and battle axes and pikes must have been amazing and indeed terrifying. And here's Henry in the middle of the battle. Now, John Keegan, the historian, in his book The Face of Battle, said that there were 8,000 to 10,000 armoured French men on foot 20 deep, in a line only about 230 metres wide. Why not access the whole front, you might ask? Well, for the reasons I told you. They don't launch at the archers, and anyway, they've been pushed together. Now, each side would thrust at each other with spears, pikes, or swords in an effort to overcome the English through man-to-man combat, clubbing, slashing, stabbing. But each French armoured man was constrained by the lack of room to manoeuvre, move his arms, and by the mass of men pushing from behind. Now, on top of that, the French had been told to shorten their pikes, and the English had not, and so the English could hold the French off at a greater distance. And then the French armour began to go down, and therefore the men behind had to step over the still wriggling carapace, metal carapace lying in the mud, and the English with their long pikes were able to push over even more against the press of the mass of armour, and the mud had a profound effect, and knights, if they fell, possibly drowned in it, or were asphyxiated by bodies falling on top of each other. And some accounts written after the battle describe piles of soldiers 6 or 7 deep. Now, the soldiers on both sides are fit, but surely they couldn't see very much of what was going on with their visors down, and they kept the visors down to protect themselves from the arrows and the pikes and the sword thrusts. Each suit of armour weighs about 40 to 60 pounds, and on top of that would be the weight of their weapons, and then the weight of the mud clogging each leg, by some estimates another 15 pounds. And it's difficult to breathe through the slits. I know that, having worn a gas mask. And only to look through narrow slots must have been very disorientated. Now, as an aside, I thought I'd just show you what the modern armoured infantry on foot looks like. And these are American and Iranian soldiers. Pretty terrifying. So let's now look at the French men-at-arms, and in particular the Marshal of France. His visor has been lifted for better visibility, should have been down to protect himself from the arrow storm. And the weapon is a poleaxe, a combined spear, axe and can opener. So, as the French infantry advanced, they came under this murderous fire from the archers, the firestorm, and that made them concentrate even further, no room to wield their weapons, and now the second battle also advanced. They were keen to get into the fight and get some credit and glory, despite what they could see happening to their front. And the command and control system seemingly disappeared under this arrow firestorm. Now, it was the turn of the archers to wheel around, the English archers, to wheel around and attack the armoured men-at-arms in their disarray. And they launched their attack using lead hammers, axes and long knives. The hammers and axes were used to concuss, the axes to prise open the weak spots in the armour, the groin, the armpits and the neck, and the knives were used through the eye slits and through visors that they first lifted up. However, John Keegan said, it's unlikely that archers would launch themselves at the mass of armour in front of them. More likely, small groups of archers would pick off individual knights who'd become separated, disorientated, wounded, or are withdrawing. And the archers could recreate the tumbling effect experienced in the middle of the melee on the French flanks. And this is what their weapons look like. You've got the knife on the left, which is called a bollock knife, and I think you can see why. And the two axes have a hammerhead and a sort of pickaxe to attack the French armour. So, the battle was won, and the English began to collect the prisoners and to recover themselves. There was a lot of dead. Of course, the third battle was still on the battlefield and looking on. So, not only was the third battle still in place and could have advanced, and at the same time, there were apparently French fresh forces beginning to approach the battlefield, of unknown strength and capability. And there was a small attack apparently to Henry's rear on the baggage train. So now comes the most controversial part of the battle, as Henry ordered the killing of the prisoners, probably because he was concerned that the prisoners could rearm themselves, pick up their weapons from the battlefield, and they could take part in a successful counterattack. So he asked the archers, the men-at-arms to have a go at killing the prisoners. They didn't want to do it, so he asked the archers to do it. Well, how on earth do you kill an armoured knight without a can opener? Well, as John Keegan says in his book, killing a man in the heat of battle and killing in cold blood prisoners who have surrendered are quite different matters. And there are rules governing relations between prisoners and captors. They guaranteed a prisoner's life. But the archers had fewer scruples and had already been killing individuals, as we've seen. He ordered 200 archers to do the job. So how many were killed? No one has given a figure. But we know that 2,000 French prisoners were taken back to England for ransom. And Keegan says it was likely the prisoners were rounded up, moved to the rear, and if they showed any form of resistance, individuals would be killed, but perhaps no more than 100. And so the battle ended. The number of casualties in subsequent reports vary enormously, from 30,000 French and 1,500 English. But taking the most reliable reports, it would appear 7,000 to 8,000 Frenchmen were killed and some 400 Englishmen. And what this picture does not show are the piles of dead, armoured men 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 deep. I just want to end by looking once more at the archers. The archer comes from reasonable stock, yeomen who may have had their own piece of land and livestock. By the way, the phrase, keep it under your hat, probably refers to the archer keeping his bowstring dry if it rained. Now, a lot of the archers were mounted, apparently, at least for the march from Harfleur to Calais. And you will note that the foot archer, in this one here, is not wearing any trousers. This is because he'd been suffering from dysentery, and so rather than having to bother with lowering the trousers all the time, they simply removed them. Now, they were not the only soldiers to have to do this. This is a picture of a Chindit column crossing a river in Burma, and men suffering from dysentery often went naked. And we better look at the arrows that were used by the English. There were various types of arrow available to the English or Welsh archer. The most common were the bodkin type that delivered sufficient kinetic energy to pierce armour, or the barbed arrow that was difficult to remove from a penetrating wound. The moon-shaped arrow on the right is fired at horses with the purpose of cutting their tendons. And here is a picture, supposedly, of the kinetic effect of arrows penetrating armour. And various studies have been done, moderately recently, looking at the penetrating power of the arrows, and the conclusion is they're not particularly great unless it's very close range and it has to hit at right angles, 50 yards perhaps at the most. And armour was improving as steel was introduced. Nevertheless, even if it didn't penetrate, it could deliver quite a blow, and it was very noisy. It must have been frightening to experience. So that more or less ends my presentation, but I just want to ask a question. Did the French lose, or the English and Welsh win? Why did the French lose? Well, Charles VI wasn't present. There was no proper command and control. The Civil War had caused distrust between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, and there was no strong overall commander. They lost the tactical battle. There was no one left in the second or third battles to observe what was going wrong and do something else, such as use the reserve to come in from behind, for example, or reorganize the cavalry to make better use of them at the critical moment. And there had been no appreciation of the effect of the mud, and they concentrated on too narrow a front. So why did the English win? While the English had made good use of ground, they did a good recce, they seized the initiative, surprised the French by moving, they did have good command and control and leadership, a unified command, and they were a band of brothers. And they had a good example from the king who was up at the front, and he maintained control. Best use was made of the archers and the weight of firepower, and the archers were prepared to use their initiative and leave their prepared positions to pick off the French. And the English didn't shorten their pikes, and they could hold off a mass of armour. So, the English won the battle, but they lost the war. France was not occupied, the state didn't collapse, the national spirit was not broken, the French king was at liberty, and the English went home having achieved nothing but the capture of Harfleur. The English sailed home after the battle and didn't return to France until 1417, when Henry V launched a successful campaign that ended with the Treaty of Troyes, establishing him as the successor to the French king. But Henry died before he could claim the throne. And the French later rallied behind the likes of the new King Charles VII and the teenage military leader Joan of Arc. So over the next few years, a resilient France retook Paris, Normandy, and several other key regions from the English. And by the time the English were defeated at the Battle of Castillon in 1453, which is the traditional end of date for the 100 Years' War, the English had lost nearly all of their French territories. Thank you.
The question and answer session will start shortly. The Q&A window will open below the video window. Please log in to ask a question.
Good evening, everyone. I'm David Innes, a trustee at the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our live question and answer session with Robin Phayre, our excellent speaker, who's just told us about the Battle of Agincourt. I think we should settle for Azincourt.
Okay.
That's how it's spelt, and that's how the sat-nav takes you if you go and visit it. Before we get into some questions, I just need to make the point that tonight's talk is very generously sponsored by Chris Hayter Transport Limited, a transport company in Witney. We didn't make that plain earlier, I'm sorry about that, but that's who is sponsoring our talk tonight, Chris Hayter Transport of Witney. Now, let's get into some questions, because the talk you gave just now was 608 years ago tonight, Robin, when Henry arrived on that battlefield. And I've got a question here, first of all, from Robert, who asks, what training did Henry's army complete, either before he set sail or when he landed at Harfleur?
Right, thank you, David. Before I answer that question, I think I ought to explain that I made some wrong nomenclature, terminology, because archers loose their arrows, they don't fire them. Firing came when there was gunpowder later on. And I do now see that I use the word fire once or twice, and that was incorrect. Now, training. Well, I've done quite a lot of research into try and find out what training actually took place, and there's not a lot on it. And I did have a word with Anne Curry, and it doesn't seem that there's much written down about that. But we're told that Henry wanted to ask the archers to be able to fire, loose, at least 200 meters, yards, 200 yards, 220 yards. And if they didn't reach that range, then they were told to go home. One other point, the archers belonged to the men-at-arms on the whole, and the system was an indenture. So the men-at-arms and the archers were indentured to the king, and they were pretty battle-hardened. They'd been fighting in France 4 or 5 times before 1415. Not only that, an archer, in order to be competent and capable and strong enough, probably trained for about 10 years before he could become a qualified archer. So even from a young boy, he was training. And we might come on later to the strength required of an archer. It was quite considerable. And so I think the training required initially over the 10 years, the battles that they'd already fought, they'd acted in concert with the men-at-arms before. They were pretty capable as an army already. And I think they proved that at Azincourt.
Indeed. And then when they got to Harfleur, I guess there must have been opportunities. I know that dysentery struck them in Harfleur, and they were badly affected by that. There must have been opportunities for some training there as well before they started out on this long march.
Again, I think the facts are not there to determine whether or not they did a lot of training.
Yeah.
They obviously had the battle themselves against the French in the town, but we're not sure what they did once Henry had made up his mind to go north.
No. Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that. The next question I've got is from Vanessa, and she wants to know, you mentioned the archers as being considered possibly as light infantry. She's not sure about that. Could archers act as scouts or act on their own initiative? And we saw in your film, in your story, some were on horseback.
Yes. I might be stretching a point by saying that they were like the light infantry. However, the orders were given by trumpet or drums or shouted. So when Henry, for example, decided to move forward towards the French, the commander of the right flank apparently went forward in front of the troops, and he threw a baton, a bit like a sort of field marshal's baton, up in the air, and he shouted, "Now strike!" Now, having a very broad Norfolk accent, it was written down as "Nostrake," but it was probably "Now strike." And everybody moved forward. The whole army moved forward, including the archers. The trumpet signals apparently could tell an archer to move forward, to retreat, withdraw, or to change direction. But there is no written record of what those calls were at all. You ask, could they take their own initiative? And the answer is yes, they could, and that was again shown when the archers went forward. When the French men-at-arms had fallen into the mud, they did go forward, and I'm afraid to say they did kill a lot of people who'd fallen on the ground. As for scouting, some of the archers were mounted. Quite a lot of the archers were mounted, and they definitely were capable of going forward. On the march from Harfleur northwards, they actually did go ahead with some men-at-arms to scout possible crossing places. They didn't find many. Eventually they did find one further east, and they were able to cross at that particular point. Just another matter of interest, apparently there were more horses at one stage than men.
Amazing.
A lot of horses.
Yeah. You were telling me when the film was being shown that a lot of horses were killed because they were in the rear with the baggage with a baggage train, I suppose.
Yes. Apparently, when the French came round that flank and attacked the baggage train, they did kill a number of horses. And that meant that when they eventually moved north towards Calais, more people were walking than on their march from Harfleur. And of course, that made them quite tired. That little flanking attack went round the rear apparently also did catch quite a lot of booty. And some valuable scabbard
English
and jewels.
booty.
English.
Yeah.
So it was moderately successful.
Indeed.
Yeah.
We talked about, you mentioned communications on the battlefield by signals, by trumpets, bugles, anything by drums?
Yes.
Did you pick up anything about this as well?
Yeah, drums were very effective.
Yeah.
Of course, the battlefield was very noisy, extremely noisy.
Yeah.
People were shouting.
Yeah.
You've got the arrows hitting armour, causing a hell of a thump. And drums sometimes weren't as effective, apparently, as trumpets. But yes, drums were used.
You mentioned, there's a question here from Peter, who's interested in the arrows and the effect of the arrows, the penetrating power of the arrows. You talked about an arrow storm. Well, we had a bit of Clive's edited not voiceover, but sound effects of an arrow storm, which must have been pretty horrific.
Yes.
What about the power of the arrow to get through the armour?
Okay, so the killing effect or wounding effect of the archers depended on two things. First of all, there was the arrow itself, which was about 30 inches long, plus the wrought iron arrowhead itself, weighed about the same weight as a large egg. Obviously, that on itself is no good. You've got to loose it from a bow. What they've estimated is that the bow could be drawn between about 140 to 180 pounds. Now, that's the equivalent of an archer lifting an 11-stone man. And when he loosed the arrow, you had that amazing kinetic effect, which could travel A, quite a long distance, and B, do quite a lot of damage when it hit whatever it was at the far end. So that's the bow itself and the arrow. The other part of the equation is the target that you're aiming at, the armour. And the armour that the French owned varied in quality, I understand. Some of it was very high class and was made of steel, and they had learnt some lessons from Crécy and Poitiers in that they were protecting some of the joints around the neck and shoulders. But some of the other armour was much weaker. And on top of that, the horses themselves had a degree of armour and leather, but again, it varied in quality. So there's been a lot of work on the penetrating power of the arrow itself. And I was watching a video the other day by an organisation called Todd's Workshop, where they did a very scientific demonstration of a bodkin hitting armour. Now, the armour of the breastplate is curved, the helmet is curved, and obviously you've got curves on the shoulders and the arms and the legs. It seemed to prove that the penetrating power of the arrows was not very good at all, unless it was the cheaper armour, or if they didn't have the protection on their shoulders, neck, and below the waist. If they only had chain mail below the waist, the arrows could penetrate that. And the arrows themselves could do a lot of damage to the horses. Now, the film I showed a moon-shaped arrow, and I've said that could probably cut tendons. It may also have been designed to penetrate the flesh of the horse and cause it to be annoyed and frightened and bleed. And so there is a thought that although the arrows may not have penetrated a lot of armour, there were parts that did, and it caused. And the other thing, of course, is if you're hit by an arrow, that's a heck of a kinetic effect. Your head would be knocked, and your natural reaction is to keep your head down, and that limits your visibility. And you might turn as well. And definitely the sides and the rear were less well protected. So there's all sorts of factors which may or may not affect the penetrating power of the armour. I don't know whether I've confused people by that or not, but...
I hope that there will be some people watching tonight from the worshipful company of Bowyers or Fletchers as well, maybe, who might be able to chip in with a few comments as we go. This seems a good opportunity, actually, if I just could pause in the questions, Robin, for a minute, just to remind people of the importance for us in this museum of donations. It's fantastic that numbers have joined us tonight. Your donations make all the difference to us. We are entirely a private organisation, and I hope you feel that we brought you a cracking good presentation tonight. You're on your sofa with your glass of whatever, and I hope you're enjoying that. But I hope you are appreciating Robin's expertise in telling his story. And if you feel warm towards the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum as a result of that, then that's fantastic. You can either do it by clicking the red button at the bottom right of your screen, or by texting. You text the word Agincourt to Azincourt, or I should say, to 70450 with the amount that you want to donate. And anything you can chip in would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much indeed for that. Now, I've got another question here, Robin, which is about numbers, really. And in your talk, the numbers seem to be difficult to tie down. And here's a question from Fiona about the size of Henry's army when it set off from Southampton, and then the numbers that made it out of Harfleur on the march.
Okay, thank you. So, as you say, the numbers are debatable.
Yeah.
But I think the most modern research indicates that there were about 12,000 fighting men. Of that, 2,260 odd were men-at-arms, and the rest of them, 9,700, were archers. And Henry deliberately chose 3 archers to 1 man-at-arms. He knew that the archers were the winning capability, and so that was the ratio that he aimed for all the time. Now, on top of that, each man-at-arms had a page. And you may think, oh, what's a page going to do on the battlefield? Is he a young boy who... Well, the page not only looks after his own master, but he will also do a lot of other things in terms of logistics. He will obviously help the man-at-arms get dressed and that sort of thing. He'll recover him, but he will also do a lot of administrative functions as well, including feeding, rations, and that sort of thing. On top of the pages, you've got the surgeons, the carpenters, the miners, all the support stuff that you need of an army of that kind. Henry, in order to transport that amount of people, and perhaps there were a total of 15,000, and you had a lot of horses. So you've got people and horses, and you've got the rations for the men. Henry wanted 3 months' worth of rations to go with them to Harfleur, and you've got the hay and straw, whatever it is, for the horses. And on top of that, you've got the cannons for the siege of Harfleur and the stone cannonballs. And that's why Henry needed about 1,500 ships, which he got from all around Europe. So that's what the numbers that left Southampton. And you asked what happened at Harfleur. Well, at Harfleur, there were clearly a few casualties, but again, modern research indicates that only about 50 English soldiers died at Harfleur. A lot of them wounded were sent back to England if they were really bad. And the real killer, again, was dysentery. And a lot of people succumbed to that, including about a third of the really senior commanders. They either died or they were sent back to England. So the numbers departing Harfleur, the numbers of fighting men capable of fighting at Harfleur probably numbered about 11,000. But he wanted to leave 1,200 people behind at Harfleur to defend it. So again, about 1/3 men-at-arms and 2/3 archers. And again, there was the logistic tail to go ahead. So I said 11,000 fighting men. That's not quite correct. 11,000 in total, including that logistic tail. So there was a thought that when he left Harfleur, he was a lot weaker than that. But I think modern numbers seem to, or modern research indicates there were actually still quite a lot of people who were going to head north. And of course, he needed the rations for that, 8 days, and he ran out. And that the morale was low at times.
I bet. And it was getting cooler.
And it was getting cooler. It was the end of the fighting season.
Yeah.
He wanted to get on, and he had a choice. What am I going to do? Am I going to return to England? Am I head north to Calais, which is my possession? Am I going to go on to Rouen and eventually Paris? He couldn't go on to Rouen and Paris. He knew there were big armies beginning to gather to try and defeat him, although those armies were very divided.
Thank you for that. I've got a question here from Peter Carouche, which is about the Welsh archers. We're back on the theme of archers. I think he'd probably say that the Welsh archers predominated in the English army, did they?
Well, I've only got a figure of 500 Welsh archers. So, Peter, I'm sorry to disillusion you, perhaps. They were very important. The Welsh archers were, again, extremely well trained. The bows that people carried could be made of yew or elm or something like that. The archers apparently used horn, and it required immense strength to draw the bow itself and loose it.
Talking about the strength required, the ship that went down in 1545, the Mary Rose, some bows were recovered from that, and some bodies, no doubt, too.
No bodies.
Do we know anything about the strength required to pull those bows that were found on the Mary Rose?
The Mary Rose...
we're talking about 140 years later.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
About 133, I think it is, roughly, bows were found, and they were in packing cases, and they were quite well preserved. They obviously had decayed, and so their strength was not as they were made a couple of years beforehand. And there was about, I think it was 3,000 arrows were found, again in cases. Obviously the metal arrowheads themselves had deteriorated, and the feathers, the goose feathers, the Fletchers had also disappeared. So there's been quite a lot of work on, okay, let's look at those bows in more detail and find out what was the force that they were capable of producing. Now, the bow itself, on average, was 6 foot. There were some a lot shorter, there were some a bit longer, 6'6". But they worked out that the draw strength could be between 140 and 180 pounds, which is a tremendous force. And the skeletons of archers, there were no skeletons found on Mary Rose, they'd all disappeared. But looking at skeletons they found in other places, the left-hand side is distorted, and there were all sorts of problems for those archers later on. The Mary Rose has provided a huge amount of information about the capabilities of the archer and the bows and the arrows themselves.
Yeah, fascinating. Very good. Thank you very much. I've got a question here about Henry, actually, and the question really is whether, in that picture you showed of him, he was on foot, and he was fighting on foot with no doubt his bodyguard around him.
Yes.
And is it your impression that Henry was on foot most of the time?
Yes.
In this battle?
When he got up that morning, he quite deliberately put on his crown, and he chose to ride on apparently a white horse up and down the line in front of him. Now, William Shakespeare says he made a wonderful speech, probably a little bit of fiction there, but he probably made several speeches And he may have made...
To different sections?
Yes, to different sections, because
Yeah.
they couldn't hear him.
No.
He had to shout.
No.
During the battle itself, everyone was dismounted, as I understand it. And Henry was in the middle. He commanded the vanguard, the central part, and he did have his own entourage. And the French directed their main effort at him. He was the valuable one. You capture him, and perhaps you might get,
Indeed.
quite a lot of money for him. And apparently his crown, I think, is at Westminster. There is a dent in his crown. And so they got pretty close to him, and they killed his brother, of course. So Henry fought on foot, and he was an inspiration. If he's there on foot, then everyone else will be inspired by his leadership, his bravery. There's no doubt about his bravery at all. So he was a truly inspiring leader.
We celebrate our warrior kings, don't we? And this one was only 28.
When he died, yeah.
I
think
28
at the
battle.
At the battle, sorry.
28, I
I
think,
beg
at the
your
battle,
pardon.
because I think he was
I
born
beg
in
your pardon.
1386.
Yeah.
So he was only 28 at the battle, 29 at the battle, which is a pretty tender age.
Yes, he had fought in previous wars. He
Yeah.
wasn't that experienced, but he had been hit by an arrow during the Welsh Wars. Again, Peter, he'd been fighting the Welsh, Owen Glendower, and an arrow had gone through the side of his head, which is why apparently we only see his face from the side. We don't ever see a picture of him frontal.
Oh, is that the reason?
Apparently.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the arrow went very deeply into his head, and there was a very clever surgeon who invented a new bit of kit to draw it out. It must have been astonishingly painful. They had to widen the entrance wound and then pull the thing out backwards. They couldn't push it forwards, and it was barbed, so it must have been excruciatingly painful. The wound itself was then covered in honey, which had a certain amount of antiseptic properties.
Yeah.
They did not know that. It was chance, I think.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you. I got a question here from Jonathan. It's a sort of strategic question, really. Did Henry make a mistake in deciding to take Harfleur? It delayed him significantly, and it weakened him somewhat. Why didn't he march straight on and simply bypass Harfleur?
Yeah.
Or was he waiting, perhaps, to find out where the French were?
No. He decided to go to Harfleur because it was an important town, important port, and it was an important town within Normandy. And if he took it, it would be a huge morale boost and a psychological defeat for the French. He decided to invest it and to take it because he needed the logistic base from which then to advance further into France. He couldn't leave Harfleur there because then he had an unprotected logistic train, so he had to take it. He didn't really have any option, but he needed the supplies to come through there to keep his army going. It was quite interesting. The day that he left Harfleur, there was a tremendous storm, and the English fleet was more or less destroyed. But by then he'd landed enough, in theory, for him to get to Calais. Of course, he didn't know the French were going to delay him somewhat.
So his journey back from Calais, after all this, with the victory behind him, was his troops were carried across by the navy, which had relocated itself.
Yes, they had. They'd gone further north, back up to Calais. Yes, yeah. Henry has been credited to a certain extent with creating the English navy, and I think it was the year after Agincourt, the French and the Genoese invested Harfleur. They blockaded it with a fleet, and Henry sent, I think it was his brother, one of his brothers, and by the way, the Earl of Oxford took part in this naval engagement off Harfleur, the Battle of the Seine, and it was a major fleet battle. and one of the first, I think, in the Middle Ages, and a very, very important one, because if the English hadn't won, it might have scotched the whole thing. They might have really lost everything that they'd tried to gain in the first place. So, yeah, an interesting little story.
Yes, yes. I've often wondered about the reception the successful Azincourt English soldier, received back in England. We know about Waterloo men being celebrated on return after the battle in 1815. Were Azincourt men celebrated as much, do you think?
I think so, but I'm not 100% sure.
No.
Henry certainly was.
Yeah.
And when he arrived back in London, well, perhaps I ought to say that on the day of the battle, a message arrived in London saying the army had been defeated. And there was great despondency. However, a few days later came the thing, great victory, and so on. So he eventually arrived in Calais, Henry, with a lot of prisoners, and he set sail, and he was welcomed in London with the most amazing pageant. He played it down himself a little bit. But yeah, so I don't know about the individual soldier being welcomed, but certainly if we look at an archer owed his loyalty to the man-at-arms, his landowner or whatever, and he enjoyed a lot of patronage as a result. He was someone who was respected by his owner, if you like, the man-at-arms, and he obviously got a bit of promotion. I suppose the other thing one should bear in mind is that why did archers fight? Why were they there? Well, they were paid quite well for a kick-off, and this indenture that they had signed laid out the terms of their pay, but also what booty they were being entitled to. So the king had a third, the men-at-arms had a third, and then the remaining third was distributed. And if you were an archer and you captured someone, then obviously you could get the credit for that as well, and a bit of
Indeed.
Loot, money, whatever, as well. And that's why they were there. And it's interesting, the Earl of Oxford, he had very little money. And the reason he wanted to join, one of the reasons he wanted to join Henry was to get the patronage, but also he needed a bit of money to keep his estate going as well.
We all remember, don't we, Henry's speech
Yes.
to his troops. Men now abed in England will think themselves accursed. They were not here on St. Crispin's Day. And we've reached St. Crispin's Day.
Yes.
And that seems to be, and I'm sorry to tell you, my friend, I know you're in full flow at the moment and you're enjoying all this, but we've run out of questions.
Oh dear.
But no matter, because I think people have had a jolly good presentation from you, and we're very grateful to you for that. I'm now going to wrap things up, and I'm going to do it in the following way. First of all, I'm going to thank Clive Smith, who's been our filmmaker and editor for the making of this film, and we got to Clive Smith. We met Clive through the Army Flying Museum, and we're grateful to them as well for that introduction. The talk which Robin gave, which you saw tonight, will be available as a recording from tomorrow on the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum website. So if you've enjoyed it tonight, do encourage your friends and so on to catch up with Robin's talk after that. Our sponsor tonight was Chris Hayter, Transport Limited of Witney. Thank you very much indeed for your support. And thank you to all of you who have so kindly donated to us tonight, to the museum. As I said part way through the questions, my goodness me, these donations make a difference to us. And without them, as Ursula indicated right at the beginning, we wouldn't be able to do these talks without your generous support. And so we really appreciate that. And when you're signing up for a donation, please also put your name down to receive regular electronic updates from the museum about what's going on, really. To Robin Phayre, for our live Q&A and our splendid talk, I want to give you a present, Robin.
Oh my goodness.
Which is it's the standard present, which, if you've seen any of our other talks before, everyone gets, because we've got some of these. And this is a history of the 52nd Light Infantry in the Great War. It's a modern history. It was written in the 1990s by Simon Harris, an anaesthetist, and it's a splendid modern-day account of a battalion at war in the Great War. And as I pass it across to you, I'm going to read out a recommendation about this book from my friend Jonathan Cheel. I don't know if you were watching tonight, Jonathan, but after you read this book, you sent an email to Simon Harris, who's the author, in which you said, "Finished it, magnificent, an absolute triumph. I have loved reliving the regiment's experience. You write with an ability to bring the reader right into the atmosphere. I feel as if I have actually met many of the participants." You know Jonathan Cheel, and
yes.
I do, and a few people have read as much military history as he has. So I think this is praise indeed for this volume, which I'm passing across to you now, my friend, with our grateful thanks.
How very kind.
Well done.
Thank you very much indeed. Totally unexpected. My goodness, I shall look forward to reading that.
I'll close now by giving a bit of a look forward, a bit more news from the museum itself. First of all, at the weekend, we unveiled our new Victoria Cross and George Cross gallantry board, which has 31 Oxfordshire names on it. Please come and have a look at it and see if you feel we've done justice to 31 sons of Oxfordshire who were decorated with either the Victoria Cross or the George Cross, or in one case the Edward Medal. And that's available for you to see in the museum right now. Events coming up, Ursula mentioned in her chat at the beginning of this evening the band concert on the 4th of November. The band concert is being delivered, as she said, by the Waterloo Band, my favourite military band, and it's in Woodstock that evening, and the theme is Remembrance. And on the 8th of November, we've got the author, we're fortunate to have the author, Dr. Helen Fry, in the museum, in person, talking on women in intelligence, the hidden history in 2 world wars. Helen may not be known to everybody, but she is the author of 2 fascinating books which I can recommend: The London Cage, The Secret History of Britain's World War II Interrogation Centre, and her second book on MI9, The History of the Secret Service for Escape and Evasion in World War II. And anyone who saw our talk on Arnhem earlier this year will remember that the escapees across the river after the battle, a month later in October 1944, were met by Airy Neve of MI9. So that will be a talk not to be missed, I think. So please make contact with the museum and buy your tickets for that talk on the 8th of November. And lastly, on the diary, so to speak, our next online talk will be on Tuesday, the 5th of December. Alden Ferguson, our Royal Air Force expert, who gave us a splendid talk earlier in the year on the Royal Air Force in Oxfordshire, will be talking on photographic reconnaissance in World War II. Not only the tasking of the aircraft that were sent out to get the photographs, but also the tricky business of interpretation. And Oxfordshire was a centre for that and famous for it. And that talk is on Tuesday, the 5th of December. So that's all from us tonight. Thank you again very much for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you another time. From me, it's good night.